welcome to this session 5 live session on MEDays talks on actually a topic that is extremely relevant today, namely multilateralism. Who cares? Basically, who WHO, taking this multilateral institution as an example, and basically looking at what is wrong with the world's order, with the institutions that have been set in place during the 20th century. Are they fit the way they are to handle the 21st century crisis, particularly one that we have witnessed very recently, namely the COVID-19 crisis that has literally exposed strength and weaknesses of multilateral institutions. We have mismanagement, failures. I mean, countries that have openly questioned the very relevance of the WHO, namely, obviously, the United States with President Trump. And basically, in an interconnected world, it would be interesting to see how actually multilateralism can be effective, and what are the leads in making sure we can actually have a system where global diplomacy and the play of major powers can be balanced, hopefully through multilateralism. And this was basically the wish after World War II. We've had some failed attempts before World War II with the League of Nations. And so basically, to discuss this issue, we have with us the members from the major superpowers, Russia and the United States. And in between, we are privileged to have 3 former foreign ministers of countries that are actually trying to balance the act with multilateral institutions and the stronger influence of major powers. So basically, I'd like to introduce, if I may, His Excellency, Mr. Yasar Yakis, who was former Foreign Minister of Turkey. You're member of the AKP, President Erdogan's party, and as well as you are as well in the organizing committee of harmonization committee of the European Union of the great National Assembly of your country. You've been obviously representative in that assembly, and you started your career also as ambassador in multilateral institutions, representing your country in multilateral institutions, namely in Vienna. Please, Your Excellency, Mr. Yakis, the floor is yours on essentially letting us know whether multilateralism and the WHO actually has been fit, or how can it be fit to handle a crisis like that? Can it be really blamed?
Thank you very much. Yes, it is a great pleasure to be with you again and with my old colleagues whom I know and remember and with whom we shared very good memories in the past. And I would like also to thank you for inviting me to this important meeting, because I think this is the 5th or 6th meeting that I participate in the Middle East days. This time it is the first time in online. In the past, it was also very pleasant to be in Tangiers, but now it is again very pleasant to do the same online. Coming to your question, I think that there are unjustified criticism directed to the WHO. Firstly, because all international organizations are like human beings. They also grow up and they become old-aged, and they become discrepant at a certain age. The COVID-19 came to the world all of a sudden with devastating effects. And of course, an organization which was continuing its routine was not prepared to meet the challenges of this pandemic. So I still believe that the the WHO is still relevant. It has to be maintained. It has to be adjusted to the realities and the requirements of the day, but it is needed. American attitude towards WHO is unjustified, in my opinion. America has done similar things for UNESCO in the past. They are the biggest payers, that's correct, but this does not justify the attitude of a superpower to cut the contributions to an important organization. The COVID-19 proved that we need a strengthened multilateralism in the world, especially in the field of health, because with devastating effect that the COVID-19 caused and the way it spread all over the world with the speed and causing the number of deaths, and it is still increasing in many countries in the world, we need more multilateralism, closer cooperation, and perhaps adjusting and improving the international organizations such as the WHO, and we will perhaps come at a later stage of our conversation, the need of improvement of other international organizations as well, mainly, of course, the United Nations Security Council. Shall I stop here or shall I elaborate?
It would be interesting to stop here so that we can have as much rounds as possible amongst ourselves. So yeah. just to set the stage, obviously the WHO is an advisory body. It cannot enforce its own recommendations. So that's an important matter to discuss in this panel. And I just want to make sure, for forensic purposes, I want just to go through the chronology of the COVID-19 crisis with the WHO on January 1st, one day before being notified by China. There is an incident management support team that has been set up at the WHO. On the 5th of January, member states are being notified. On the 14th, then the controversy starts. The WHO mentions limited human-to-human transmission on the 14th of January. And on the 21st of January, it confirms the human-to-human transmission. And it won't take until the end of the month, January 30th, to declare a public health emergency of international concern. Obviously, then different responses have followed. Recommendations have been followed by some countries and some not, namely the US. And the WHO has been active then in delivering testing kits, and then I'll go on with the 14th of April on the later stage with Trump announcing that he's going to halt funding from the WHO, about a third of its funding, 400 million are out of the 2.2 billion dollar budget, and obviously on the 29th of May, he announces its withdrawal, his intent to withdraw, and on the 7th of July, he basically notifies the UN system that he withdraws from the WHO. I'm sorry for this lengthy sequence, but I just want to make sure we get the sequence right, so that we set the stage for what has happened with this particular multilateral institution. In order to talk about this, I'd like to further open the floor to His Excellency Mr. Peter Balas, who has been Foreign Minister of Central European country, Hungary. He has been he's an academic and has been European Commissioner for regional policy. So the floor is yours, Your Excellency. What in your view, seeing the sequence of events, what has gone wrong, and what can we take from this failure? to have a unanimous response to the COVID crisis? Is it personal leadership? Is it structural issues, states versus multilateralism? What is basically the failure of the COVID? What has COVID-19 exposed essentially?
Thank you very much for the invitation. It's good to see old colleagues, even if it's only on the screen. And I'm really missing the wonderful MEDays at 10 years, which was so usual every year to see each other. Maybe next year we can meet again. Now, COVID-19 has created a special situation, shedding a new light on the need of multilateralism and on certain efficiency questions of multilateralism. Of course, WHO has been in the limelight when individual countries were eagerly searching for solutions. And they would have required maybe more help, more support from the WHO. Of course, it would be useful to coordinate knowledge about how to treat the infected people, how to reduce the death toll, how to find the vaccine. This is actually on the agenda of many countries. But the action of the US administration under President Trump has reminded us on the utility of all multilateral organizations in general, because this was not a unique or separated action of the US administration retiring financement from WHO, but acting outside the rules and the framework of the World Trade Organization, refusing or retiring from the Paris Climate Agreement, questioning the UN regulation on international migration, retiring from the nuclear deal with Iran, and so on. So this was a general approach, a general attitude, which has encouraged some other countries, including mine, of opting for a sovereignist drive, which is contrary to the international order we have inherited from the post-Second World War structure. And the US was obviously in the core of that international system, initiating the creation of the United Nations, the Bretton Woods institutions. So it was a real turn in the world, whereas everybody knows that if we like to have a stable and predictable rule-based order, then we need to fix common objectives and common norms, possibly set in an agreement, and we have quite a range of such agreements. We need a common information system to know what is happening all across the world, and we need strong common executive bodies which are there for the implementation of the common rules, for surveillance, what is happening in the states, and a very important point for dispute settlement, where one of the models is the World Trade Organization dispute settlement mechanism with a lot of experience. Now, the question is, how can we get out? There is great hope after the not yet final, but very encouraging outcome of the US presidential election, because we can see a highly experienced politician in the person of Joe Biden, who could turn the wind and who could come back to the multilateral world of organizations, norms, and discipline.
Thank you very much. And I thank you for mentioning also the winds that also blow in the region and that I've been personally involved with for an energy transition. But it is also related to the Paris Agreement and the major challenges that lay ahead that an individual country can hardly address without a consensual approach and concerted approach with the rest of the world's nations. So I'm going to introduce the next speaker, and I know you have a personal relationship with him. Basically, you have, and I don't know whether it's common in border crossing laws, but I know that you have actually stamped the passport of His Excellency Mr. Vuk Jeremic as the first person from Serbia entering the European Union without a visa. And Mr. Vuk Jeremic, you were actually Foreign Minister of Serbia in very challenging times. Looking at your record, I realized that in 1 year you have actually flown. You were in the air about over 29 days to try to convince the rest of the world over a crisis that your country was faced with. And I'm also happy to have you among us because you were one of the candidates for the post of the Secretary General of the United Nations. You came in second after Antonio Guterres. And based upon the inner working of the Security Council, one of your major assets was not only were you representing Eastern European country, which was never represented at the Secretary General of the United Nations level, but also due to the fact that you were promising reforms in the UN system. So based upon this short introduction, I cannot extend further. Your Excellency, Vuk Jeremic, former Foreign Minister of Serbia, the floor is yours. What do you have to say to the current crisis?
Well, thank you very much for this truly kind introduction, and it's a great honor to be back at the Med, although virtually this time. It's great to see some old friends, and thank you for raising this anecdote of myself and Peter making this historical crossing into the European Union for Serbian citizens. It was many years ago. So good to see you all, and very much hope to be able to see you in the future in vivo, in one of the most beautiful cities of the world, in my opinion, Tangier. It's a very timely discussion, obviously, and thank you for raising the UN, and some of the previous speakers touched upon that too. I'm obviously very fond of the UN. I'm a convinced multilateralist. I served as president of the UN General Assembly in 2012 and 2013, and I did have this honor to run for the post of Secretary General. At the time when I ran for the post, that was 2016, the world has already been deep into a decade of profound dysfunctionality of the United Nations system. And what I believe lies at the heart of this dysfunctionality is the dysfunctionality of the UN Security Council. The UN Security Council has gone into a period of an extended paralysis. It started back in 2008. I was foreign minister at that time. But that year was a year when lots of illusions about the post-Cold War world and functioning of the world order, these illusions came to the fore. Some would call it Russia's moment of return to history, because in 2008, the dysfunctionality of the Security Council started off with, first of all, Kosovo dispute, and then extended into Georgia dispute, and then many other things came one after another. But we're now in 2020, and Security Council, the flagship, some would call it the central organ of the United Nations, is not in a very good shape. And when the Security Council is not in a good shape, then the whole atmospherics and the whole of the UN isn't great either. And when the UN runs into troubles, the central, if you will, the central organization of the multilateral order as we know it, then this dysfunctionality trickles down to all the agencies, regional programs, and obviously the World Health Organization as well. We've been hearing and witnessing lots of criticism about the functioning of the World Health Organization, and it's obviously a hardly perfect organization, not been created by human beings. At the end of the day, is perfect, but because of the pandemics, because of the frenzy, because of the crazy year of 2020, the year of the coronavirus, probably WHO was the most visible and the most visibly criticized, if you will, international organization. And a lot of people put into the fore the funding problems or President Trump's withdrawal from the WHO, but I think that's hardly a full answer to why the WHO has become so dysfunctional. Obviously, there are potentially very good news for those who believe in multilateral order, multilateralism, and we have yet to see how American political and electoral crisis is going to end up, but it looks increasingly likely that in the future America is going to step back into the fray of multilateralism, with President-elect designate for the time being Biden, who promised to rejoin the WHO and to get America back to the Paris Climate Agreement. I think this is great news. I hope the same, if it happens, that the same is gonna happen with UNESCO and the Human Rights Council. That'd be certainly very good news. It is difficult to imagine the functioning of multilateral organizations without the most powerful nation on Earth. But we have to see that. How's that going to function? I read very carefully President-elect designate Biden's recent essay in the Foreign Affairs, and he writes at length about this. What I also, what gave me a little bit of concern in this regard when reading Joe Biden's essay was that he failed to mention the United Nations. And I understand that the United Nations might not be the most popular thing right now in America, and with big chunks of issues and big difficulties that I'm sure the next administration is going to prioritize domestically in terms of healing the cracks in America itself. I nevertheless hope that it's not only going to be about returning to Paris or returning to the WHO, that it would be really also about going to re-engage very, very seriously in the United Nations and trying to use its overwhelming power, both hard and soft, so that the UN system as a whole starts functioning a little bit better. And in conclusion of the first part of my remarks, I think that we must talk about the reform of the WHO and look at it through a very honest lens of the current weaknesses. And one of the most significant weaknesses is that it's not as vocal, it's not as open, it's not as honest as I believe it should be when it comes to criticizing, if necessary, even the biggest members, even the biggest donors. It was open in the past. I remember WHO's threatening of closing office in China during the SARS 2003 pandemic. I remember criticism of Nigeria with regard to the polio vaccine. I remember Tanzania's censure back in the days. But it has never been really about criticizing the most powerful members. We all know about China. Just one more sentence. We all know about China. We all know about criticizing small ones, but we have not heard criticisms of, for example, Japan over the Yokohama ship. We have not heard the criticisms of the European Union over at the beginning somewhat of a bungled response to the pandemics and so on and so forth. So at the heart of it is honesty, and in the rest of the panel, I hope we're going to speak about some concrete steps that one can undertake and imagine. I apologize for being a little bit too long.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, you raised the fundamental issue. You mentioned the issue of funding, and whoever obviously contributes most to a multilateral institution has its voice heard louder, obviously within these institutions. So that's a very, very delicate issue. You know, I can't help you. You mentioned the United States. You mentioned Japan. We know that Japan is a very large contributor to the UN system, and so. Indeed, how do you balance the need for this institution to secure funding and their role of being impartial players of a globalized world? We're going to raise this issue during the debate, which I hope will be as interactive as possible. As I had mentioned earlier, we have open questions that can be asked through a live streaming that is currently made on Facebook. And this is what I'd like to mention. Basically, you know, talk also about Security Council and the very setting, the very architecture, the multilateral architecture, whether it fits for today's challenges. And and we now have actually two panelists from the superpowers. Military, diplomatic, historical superpowers, namely the United States and Russia. And I'd like to yield the floor now first to the United States, because we obviously, you know, it's not the big elephant in the room because you're among us. We talk about the huge criticism of the big splash that President Trump has made on multilateral institution, its logic at least. And we have to debate this issue. Professor Mark Ellenbogen, who actually comes from a business, diplomatic, and philanthropic background, and very active, obviously, in the Democratic Party as well. And without further ado, Mark, I'd like to open the floors to you to let us know basically what you think about the decision of Trump, whether it has had a precedent in history, whether it was actually something in the making, regardless of any presidency, or whether, as some wish, whether we're going to come back to the multilateralism golden age with the future presidency of President Biden, if he's confirmed.
Thanks, Khalid. I mean, of course, I think multilateral, I'm not speaking for the campaign or the president-elect, but you know, as a son of a family that was mostly overseas and who grew up overseas, of course, I can't help that I come from a mixed background, partly Central European, partly German, and of course, US and Canada. But my feeling is that multilateralism is in a deep coma. And with some exception of using it for, I'll say, nation state needs, their own needs, and giving lip service to it, I think it's not something that's just happened under the Trump administration. And of course, the World Health Organization's issues and the issues that many people, including NGOs and countries and different institutions have with it, were around long before the COVID virus came along and President Trump's decision to pull out. It's complicated because I think the expectation that the United States is going to come back and that we're going to be sort of the knight in white shining armor and we're going to take the role that we did after World War II and in other things is a little lost, in the sense that there are so many issues going on in the United States right now, vis-a-vis COVID, vis-a-vis the economy, vis-a-vis even a country divided in itself. And as a centrist and a more right-leaning member of the Democratic Party, And when I held one of the vice chair positions, there was a constant conflict in the party itself. Do I think it's good that Joe Biden is going to become part of the international order again? I mean, we were, and in all fairness to us being criticized during COVID, and trust me, I think that the response of the government was abysmal in the United States and in general. There were many institutions, including ours, that were running around delivering masks, delivering smocks, delivering respirators. So while the government itself wasn't playing ball, the fact is that many institutions, including the Gates Foundation, which of course is one of the largest sponsors at the WHO, were continuing their work and continue to do it today, as does ours. And of course, during the campaign, we've had many issues. And even if the United States, through its president, came across like a gorilla, for lack of a better terminology, the issue of how the information got out, how China dealt with it, not to speak the PR representative of the current US government, I think is one of the big questions. And also how one had to react. We're now facing, as far as multilateralism goes, how do you balance human rights issues, with Peter Balish brought up, or environmental issues, or when you run for a campaign for the UN, as the Serbian former foreign minister did, what issues do you raise? And so the balance between how do you keep people employed? How do you, on the one hand, keep economies going? But on the other hand, how do you protect people's lives? How do you prevent them from getting the virus? How do you develop a vaccine? And do I think Sputnik is good? Yes, I do actually think Sputnik is good, but it's unclear if it fights every version of the virus. And so if you think that there are 13 versions of it, I think there are also 13 versions of internationalism and multilateralism. And each country handles that in a different way. I was talking to friends of mine today in Hong Kong who were amongst the 4 people thrown summarily out of the Hong Kong parliament. And, you know, China, on the one hand, is the nation at the World Economic Forum that seemed to represent following institutions internationally the most, but on the other hand, in its actions, it does little. I guess at some point in different areas, the US can be accused of that as well. So do I think the mood of the new government is going to change? Yes. Do I think that Joe Biden is going to be a more comfortable international player? Yes. But it isn't necessarily the case that all of the issues that all of you have talked about and the expectations of the United States coming back to be what it had been after World War II and before the fall of communism and then thereafter is going to return. So those are my initial comments, Khalid.
But let's not forget, Mark, that President-elect Biden was for many years chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, and we talked about who funds the United Nations. The largest contributor to the United Nations is the United States. And actually, who is the person who signs the check to the United Nations from the US is actually the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee. So this is a role that he has assumed, and I can assure you, talking about experience, that when somebody writes a check, also at the Foreign Relations Committee, he likes to have some issues addressed. So obviously, President-elect Biden knows the weight of the United States within the United Nations. He has exerted it before. And that's also a concern about even if he goes back and uses the United Nations as a strong tool to address global crisis, how can the United Nations ensure that issues are being handled in a balanced way? This is just to open up the floor for our next speaker, Dr. Mikhail Troitsky from the Moscow Institute of International Relations. So I'm going to go back in history. It's Henry Kissinger that dubbed this institution the Harvard of Russia. Graduates from this institution have the highest pay coming out of this university. You have prestigious heads of states that have come out of it. Obviously, Foreign Minister Lavrov is a graduate from this institution. And so there is no doubt that the contribution of this institution to international diplomacy throughout the years have been quite significant over the years. That is introducing the Moscow Institute of International Relations, of which you are a dean and a professor. And I also want to mention that you were in the Russian Academy of Sciences, and you have also been the representative of the Russian Bureau for the John and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation. Dr. Troitsky, the floor is yours. What do you say to address actually the influence of major powers, perhaps one more than another, and the concern of the rest of the world community over the management or mismanagement of multilateral institutions, particularly during this COVID crisis?
Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for this general introduction of my university, and as well as of Russia as a superpower. So the the bar is high, and I should probably try not to disappoint. And so let me just mention from the outset that I'm only speaking here in my personal capacity, and I'm just about to give you my brief analysis of the outlook for multilateralism as we were requested in this session. So apparently multilateralism that we are asked to discuss is a trend towards solving problems collectively, as opposed to everyone dealing separately with the implications of those problems for themselves. And it's clear that multilateralism has quite a few advantages. First, if cooperation grows stronger, then conflict is being crowded out in general, right? And second, collectively, you are much more often able to deal with the causes of problems rather than with their symptoms that everyone deals with separately and individually. Now, the World Health Organization that we are asked to discuss here as a case in multilateralism, I think represents a very special form of multilateralism. Its path, its current predicament, and its future, I think, are not very much indicative of the prospects of multilateralism as a way of addressing global challenges. And yet, of course, some comments are due with regards to the WHO as this burning issue when we discuss multilateral responses to global challenges. So the WHO as a multilateral organization is a manifestation of multilateralism, but it did not perform spectacularly well at the beginning of the COVID-19 crisis. It was apparently held back from obtaining and disclosing information that major powers, and primarily China, I believe, thought would have affected their national interest. And yet, however, once the presence of the virus was recognized, the WHO did a good job explaining the risks, then building models of the spread of COVID, and then advocating measures to address those threats. So, even when you want to combat, mask behavior, the wearing of a mask as a political message, then you might want just to cite WHO recommendations that are unequivocal in terms of the usefulness of masks, or face masks, right? But it would clearly, the WHO would clearly not do anything that would irritate major powers, first and foremost China. So there has been no investigation, for example, of the origins and sources of the virus that could well have been led by the WHO. That said, the WHO is helpful when it comes to expertise, perhaps early warning, but we always have to keep in mind that any such institution will be secondary to politics at the times of acute controversy and blame games. And depending on personalities in the leadership positions, such organization will either play to the tune of a major sponsor, which seems to be the case with WHO, or it will become stalemated because of political differences among major powerful member states, which I think is the case with organizations in Europe with broader membership and missions such as the OSCE or the Council of Europe, or even the United Nations Security Council, as you follow some of the discussions that are unraveling there these days. Otherwise, I do not think we are experiencing so much for the WHO, and a few general comments about multilateralism. So contrary to what the ambassador just said, I do not think we are experiencing isolationist currents in world politics generally these days. I think that ad hoc multilateralism is alive and well, and nations, large and small, are indeed on the lookout for opportunities to achieve better outcomes in the areas that are concerned with by enlisting support of other players, from other players. And multilateralism is alive and well in the European Union or the ASEAN, for example. And I believe Russia as well has been quite creative as of late, looking for rather unusual coalitions, such as the one with Turkey. So the limits of the go it alone approach have become clear over recent decades, and you will have problem naming a state that is capable of achieving its officially declared foreign policy objectives without cooperating with other states. The Donald Trump's America, I believe, was a fluke, was a short-lived experience, and it actually showed that even on unilateralist rhetoric alone, without much of policy shifts away from multilateral solution, even the rhetoric alone can cause serious damage to your standing in the world. And you solve almost no outstanding problems, such as North Korean or Iranian nuclear ambitions, or low European defense spending, or trade imbalances with China, or arms control with Russia. But what you do instead is you undermine your credibility that may play out badly for you in a crisis. Now, finally, what are the main hurdles to the multilateral approach to addressing common challenges such as pandemics, such as climate change, transborder flows of migration, and so on? So first and foremost, I believe the main hurdle is that we have is domestic politics. And it really takes a resilient political system with high legitimacy to choose multilateral responses to problems over unilateral responses. So if you have a fragile authoritarian system, you are afraid of taking up serious international commitments, because those may limit your freedom of maneuver in domestic politics, and other states may try to hold you accountable for those commitments, and at the same time implementing them may undermine your your key domestic agendas, basically the preservation of power. So real multilateralism is a game for serious political systems, meaning legitimate and I would say democratic. But of course, there are always limits as to how much popular support a leader can risk to lose, even in a democratic political system, by, for example, reducing barriers to trade, or by admitting scores of refugees. But more legitimate political systems and popular leaders across the globe, I think, will almost certainly lead to more multilateral solutions. And then the second hurdle to multilateralism, I think, has always been the asymmetry of consequences of the common challenges for individual players, right? This clearly applies to climate change globally, or to managing immigration to the European Union, and so forth. So the less affected you are, the weaker interest you have in cooperating in multilateralism. But as the problems become more acute, I think the higher pressure there will be to look for multilateralism.
Particularly since...
of course, we have regular security dilemmas and the problems of distrust that you need to overcome in order to cooperate, but that is overcome by means of reassurance. So overall, just to sum it up, I think that ultimately the future of multilateralism hinges on the resilience of domestic political systems globally, as well as on the scale of the challenges that would require multilateral solutions. That's it. Thank you for your attention.
You know, the only thing that I think about your comments, while of course I agree that multilateralism is important and that we should be engaged, is, and you talked about it, I mean, it's not just domestic issues. And you know, Trump may be a failed phenomenon, but he did get 71.5 million votes, maybe even 72. I'm not sure what the last count is. And so you said that domestic issues put you across, but of course, these things are being played asymmetrically. It's like playing on 50 chessboards, upwards, downwards, in each direction, having to worry about where you move the queen, where you move the rooks, and not just for selfish interest, but because it's true that people extrapolate these issues differently. And so, you know, people who have power and people who are used to playing the international game, I'll call it, benefit from these rules, but not necessarily SMEs, not necessarily other institutions, organizations, NGOs, individuals who are the ones who suffer the most, as for example, they did during COVID. When you set aside $2.3 trillion and the people who actually got the money in the end were more the top of the food chain than sort of normal workers in a restaurant, even hospitals, even healthcare workers, senior citizen centers, and so on, then even though I agree in principle about international affairs, I think one of the big issues is the functionality of the institutions when they approach these issues.
So, Mark, if I may follow up on your remarks, there's obviously a question based upon the overwhelming support, the 71 million votes that President Trump has collected during the last election. One person asked, do you think that the return of the US in the multilateral system would be more symbolic, or would it be effective?
Are you asking me to answer that question, or you want each person to?
That's right.
Well,
That's
no,
right.
I don't know is the answer. I hope it's not symbolic. And I hope that the US does actually intend to fulfill its commitments and to be part of the international order again. But I fear, Khalid, given all the issues we're confronted with internally, that it won't be quite on top of the agenda issue, minus the signatures, minus all the things that the dean talked about. But in terms of being proactive, I think we're going to be less as a country than we have been.
Okay, I have a question that I'd like to address to Mr. Jeremic. Basically, based upon the COVID crisis, do you think essentially that the US withdrawal from the WHO can influence other nations to take similar measures in the future vis-a-vis this institution?
Well, I first and foremost believe that there's a very strong chance that the United States is going to return to the WHO, and therefore this issue of departing from multilateral organizations is not going to be too high on the agenda after that move. But I also do agree, on the other hand, I do agree with Mark that even a newly enthusiastic America, when it comes to multilateral engagement and international relations, is not going to bring us anywhere near the status quo ante that we used to have before Trump, or before the international organizations, including the Security Council of the United Nations, came to near paralysis. I think there's going to be a better atmospherics. I think that there's going to be a little bit more of a warmer diplomacy, but I think it's going to take time. It's going to take years, and it's going to take a lot of courage and a lot of appetite for benevolent leadership on behalf of not just America, but a few others, in order for us to be moving in the right direction again.
Talking about leadership, and leadership in particular of these multilateral institutions, I mean, Cyril Svoboda in the opening session of the MEDays talks has mentioned the importance of personalities that are heading these institutions, and the role they can play in empowering their mission. within these institutions. The thing is, with the WHO and with the science-based threats, existential threats to mankind, there's obviously, this is science, not politics. We should be able to handle that. But let's not forget that actually the WHO has been criticized for sometimes either being slow to respond to a global health crisis that happened before in 2014 with the Ebola crisis, and we have seen with the H1N1 crisis in 2009, where it quickly overreacted. So it's kind of difficult when you're running an institution like that, based upon challenges, daily challenges that come up, to identify the appropriate response that can have a unanimous support among member states. Can I ask perhaps Mr. Yassariakis to respond to that? What do you have to say, basically? Personalities of leaders of this institution versus the continuous natural criticism, because we're adapting to threats, and obviously every threat is new, and it's a learning by doing process. What do you think about that?
Actually, the international organizations are the bosses of the international organizations are the national countries, national governments, and the head of the organization, international organization, is a technical person who is under the orders and the commands of the national states. What he can do, he can use his skills in order to abide by the instructions received by the countries. The decision makers should always be the national countries. If the head of the international organization goes beyond the instructions, beyond the terms of reference of this organization, he will be exceeding his competences. So there should be a balance. The head of the international organization should do as much as possible, remaining within the limits of the instructions developed by the member countries. But within this area, he has a lot of freedom of action to do as good as possible to achieve the instructions to be modeled and shaped by the national governments. So it's a balance. It is neither entirely in the hand of the national governments nor entirely in the hands of the head of the international organization.
But Yassir, where is leadership then in that institution? You're basically creating a series of bureaucrats who happen to come from different countries. And so who then takes the lead if a WHO doesn't take it, or a UNESCO, or a NATO, or a European Union, or any of the institutions, if they basically are bureaucracies that are being bureaucratic and acting like bureaucrats?
Actually, whoever prevails in the decision makers of the member countries, of course, he has the advantage. But we should not leave the initiative, too much initiative, to the head of the international organizations that goes beyond the limits traced and made by the national governments. If it goes beyond that, then it becomes an independent animal which does not listen to what the national government says. So there should be a balance, but the main rule has to remain that the decisions are made by the national governments. The balance between the national governments is, of course, discussed among the nations, but the implementation has to be done by the implementing agency, which is the international organization, without going too far.
But let's not forget that obviously taming sovereign countries is also a challenge within the UN system. And I've got a question here. for Mr. Ellenbogen. Actually, you have often criticized President Trump these last years during the MEDays forum on many international issues, but the Middle East. And so basically, we've had a passionate debate with the late Dr. Saeb Arkat on this issue. And considering your involvement with the Democratic Party, do you think that the United States would comply to international rule of law? And for example, what would we see in the Middle East? For example, would actually return of the embassy from Jerusalem back to Tel Aviv be a good move to try to empower the rule of international law and empower actually these multilateral institutions? Otherwise, the lid is open, the Pandora box is open, and every country can do anything it wants. What do you have to say to that?
Well, first, let me say that I was very pained by Saeb's death. And of course, it's proof that COVID is alive and dangerous for those people who want to pretend it doesn't exist. And as far as the issues with the United States vis-a-vis being part of the international order, I did also in the past, as you well know, Khalid, criticize that the antecedent sufficient conditions for Trump behaving the way he does and taking the stands he does didn't happen at all during his time, but during 8 years of Obama, even though it was kindler and gentler, and the ends of the Bush administration before that. And so do I think that the US should have its embassy in Jerusalem? I think there's room for discussion, but we do have a Congress who in the 90s passed that, and it's been delayed by successive presidents because they were hoping that there would be a two-state solution. Whether that is going to happen seems to be farther and farther away. That's the one thing. The second thing you asked me is, you asked about some institution. I'm sorry, what did you ask about?
Well, I just mentioned the fact that if individual member states do not follow the rules.
Yes, no, absolutely. But I want to say, yes, but that brings us back to what Dean Trotsky says, and it is something that I get concerned about coming from a mixed background. Ich meine, obwohl ich Englisch spreche, ist meine Muttersprache Deutsch. So my mother tongue is German. And the fact is, coming from that kind of mixed background, I do agree with Dean Trotsky that when nationalistic or domestic issues for countries take over them working on international issues, it's bad. It's like a soccer team. You can't play without a goalie and without a right wing or a left wing or different things. So still, maybe what the world needs is that international institutions actually do need to have the, excuse my French, cojones to take the lead and to not always listen to national interests, because when they do, despite your point, Yasser, they then do exactly get caught up, and maybe they do need to take a step back to be independent, to have the, what word did Dean Trotsky use? What's the word? I'm sorry. The courage to take a stand on these things, even if nation states disagree, because issues aren't run by nation states, or they shouldn't. That's where we should exactly be trying to find commonalities.
Okay, we have Vuk, you wanted to add something earlier. Please go ahead.
As a country that very recently committed itself to moving the embassy to Jerusalem, as a matter of fact, Serbia is actually a third country in the world after the United States and Guatemala, if I'm not mistaken.
Czech Republic, I believe.
Serbia is definitely amongst the very few who decided to do that. Our president went to Washington a few months ago and ended up gambling very strongly on Trump by signing this thing. I wanted to join everybody in the morning of Saeb Arkat, who was also a very dear friend, and but I want to touch upon the personalities issue when it comes to running international organizations, as well as freedom or independence from the agenda of the member states that Mr. Yakis mentioned. I think it is, under the current geopolitical circumstances, I think it is next to impossible to be just like a very disciplined servant of the member states within a scope of a big multilateral organization. I think that there are such widely open disagreements, even amongst the most important, the biggest players. I think it is absolutely impossible to do any kind of reform if you are just going to seek for like the least common denominator. Because in most issues, the least common denominator is almost zero. And unless a leader of an organization decides to act boldly and perhaps put to grave his or her hopes for re-election, very, very little can be done, even theoretically, under the circumstances. When I run for Secretary General, I ran on a promise that I'm going to change many things. That's perhaps why I haven't won this race. But unless you commit yourself in advance and then do certain things, despite pressures from member states or big powers, I don't think that there is hope of achieving anything.
So you've essentially answered the question that was asked on obviously your fervent support for multilateralism and also your friendship towards Morocco as a Serbian foreign minister, having supported Morocco's territorial sovereignty. And basically, the international opinion is more and more reluctant towards the role of international multilateral institutions. And basically, you think it falls back to personality of the leaders of these institutions to give now credibility to its actions. That's basically what you've just said. I just wanted to make sure I had this question recorded for that purpose. And we have a question from Alassane Soleimani via Facebook, and that question is directed to Mark. Basically, Trump didn't visit Africa. Is it because of his unilateralism or any lack of interest in the African continent? Will Biden really change that Trumpian deep hole made in international relations? We are obviously a forum of the South, so we'd like you to address this question, if you could, Mark.
Well, I think President Trump was an idiot not to involve Africa. It obviously has a large population, lots of resources, different issues. Do I think that President Biden is going to change that? Well, I guess it depends on what the new Secretary of State, unclear who that could be, although there are some articles that have come out that suggest names, and who the undersecretaries and the assistant secretaries in those areas are. And one of the principal issues is that because Mr. Trump did it alone on his own and believed in that you didn't have many of those positions filled. And so in a bureaucracy that changes 5,000 people after each new president, from secretary to deputy secretary to undersecretary, and in between principal deputy undersecretary, assistant deputy undersecretary, it just goes on. You didn't have all the people in place to focus on Africa. Do I think he will inherently change the way the US deals with Africa in those 4 years? Yes.
And to add to this, let's not forget that Vice President Biden came to Marrakesh on his very birthday on the 2014 to support the entrepreneurship, the global entrepreneurship summit, which was organized in that city. So that was quite moving, actually, as I participated to this event, to have the Vice President of the United States support entrepreneurships on the continent.
Well, I think you have to look no further than Vice President-elect Harris to see how Biden feels about dealing with these issues. Although prima facie, she's considered a conservative Democrat, I think that's a big statement about how the U.S. will approach both multilateral, ethnic, migration, and other issues.
Let's hope for the best. We have a question now that I'd like to address to Mr. Balatz. And basically, do you think that multilateral cooperation should be at the regional level, for example, with the widening of Europe? I mean, taking the model of Europe, could we see a new form of multilateralism, first of all? And I'd like to touch on the widening of the multilateral institutions such as the European Union. We talked about also some issues of widening multilateral frameworks, which is obviously something that I'd like to have Dr. Troitsky respond to. Obviously, we talk about widening of the EU, widening of NATO. Obviously, Russia has a different view on it. So if you can start, Mr. Balazs, on this issue, and Dr. Troitsky, if you can reply to probably what Peter Balazs has to say. Please go ahead, Peter.
Thank you very much. This is an excellent question. And in fact, in the European Union, we have a daily exercise of multilateralism, because the EU in itself is a multilateral structure. 27 states are dealing with each other. And as a general matter of fact, states create multinational or multilateral organizations in order to get some external help to their home governance. So they want institutions like WHO or WTO or many others to be extremely helpful, but not to interfere into their internal business. So there is a very interesting balancing, looking for executive persons, top executives of international organizations. They should be highly skilled, speaking a lot of languages, knowing the job, but being rather modest as far as political ambitions are concerned. And there is the saying that not the tail should wave the dog. So not the international organization should direct the member states. We can observe it on many examples. Now comes something unexpected, and this is the case with WHO. WHO was a peaceful, well-managed organization. They collected data from the whole world, disseminated information. So this was a source of information. Okay, and then comes a strong, unexpected shock, the COVID-19. And then we measure the efficiency and the performance of a structure. The same happened with the European Union a few times. The last challenge was the overseas migration wave towards Europe in 2015. This was an unexpected, big external shock, and our refugee system proved to be inefficient. It didn't work because the whole thing was shifted to the entry points of the European Union. And when tens of thousands entered every day, the territory of Greece or Italy, and later on Hungary after crossing the Western Balkans, it proved to be inefficient. So in critical cases, there should be good leaders, more competencies, and more money for those international organizations if we like them to be helpful. And my direct answer to the question is, the bigger the better. If, of course, we have to start from regional structures because they have a lot of common to do. But if we can extend the action, for instance, for the European Union, it would be obvious to extend the enlargement process because it has stopped. It has stopped, and France started opposing new admissions, which created very bad reactions, mainly on the Western Balkans. Already after the migration crisis, I raised, for instance, the idea why not to include the whole Western Balkans, starting with Serbia and ending with Albania, into the Schengen system, into the free movement, with the same obligations. Then we could sit around the same table and handle the same problem in common. And there should be many other things along the eastern borders of the EU, with Ukraine, with Moldavia, and with other countries. So we should be open, but let me emphasize that with good leaders, with more money and more competencies.
Okay, thank you very much. Obviously, you mentioned the leadership issue. You mentioned also the money issue. That's a very, very sensitive issue because we've seen that as soon as China starts to pour in more money in multilateral institutions, then of course the vested or the usual sponsors of multilateral institutions are obviously very wary of any influence that country can have, and we've seen that with the WHO. But that's why I'd like Dr. Troitsky to, if he could address both issues, the issues that was raised on expanding regional multilateral institutions and the state of play of major powers, and also the funding of multilateral institutions and the newcomers in trying to expand the funds of these institutions.
Yeah, sure. Just a few points. I think on leadership, it's clear that entrepreneuring leaders, in the good sense of the word, are necessary to advance the cause of multilateral organizations. And certainly, if a leader of such organization is susceptible to, or even hostage to some member states' parochial interests and agendas, especially if that member state is a major funder, then of course there's a possibility that such organization gets stalemated and it basically blows up because of the manifold contradictions, and the mandate of such leaders is blocked. So so leaders need to be entrepreneuring, and they need to build coalitions all the time, and they need to enlist support, and it's a very tough, unenviable task. But then too much of such initiative, as I think Foreign Minister Yeremi just mentioned, could backfire and could lead to paralysis, just like insufficient initiative and insufficient entrepreneurship. Okay, but visionary leadership is important. So a vision, the substance of leadership is important. So if you are able to excite your member states with your ideas, with your, genuinely multilateral agendas, then I think you are going to get funding, and you are going to get the support that is needed to actually advance the cause of your organization that you personally as the leader believe in. Now, secondly, multilateral organizations such as the European Union and NATO advancing and expanding. Well, yeah, this is the flip side of multilateralism, and that I call integration dilemmas, just similar to security dilemmas. So basically, if you keep strengthening multilateral cooperation in close groups or among closed groups of states within clubs, so to say, and there are others who have reason to worry about being left out of those clubs, or have having little prospect of joining those clubs for any sort of reasons that can be security reasons, but that can well be reasons of status and prestige, then those actors that are left outside get upset, and then those clubs and that kind of multilateralism faces resistance if there's a coalition of actors that don't like this kind of closed club, although the club itself may be spectacularly effective in addressing the challenges. Now, okay.
We have the question, if you talk about personality of multilateral institutions, we obviously have W.H.O Jeremic that came on a platform to try precisely to change and to give the voice of other countries, perhaps a lot more countries that would like to have a voice in these institutions. And we've seen how that has been frustrated. So I'd like W.H.O to follow up on this issue. And I have another question also talking about the personality of people running these institutions. Obviously, we haven't heard anything from Secretary General Gutierrez on the US election, while we also have had President Erdogan, who has congratulated the Vice President-elect. So that's the next question for you, Mr. Yakis, right after W.H.O. Please go ahead, W.H.O.
Well, thanks for raising this question, and also thanks to Peter for very eloquently explaining our situation with regard to the enlargement of the European Union in terms of future functionality of our ultimate multilateral institution in Europe, which is the European Union. Europe did go through its 9/11 moment in 2015, when it was really shocked by this flow of refugees, and this was another like 9/11 moment, not just for Europe, but for the whole world with COVID. Usually, big shocks like that lead to changes in multilateral cooperation, sometimes for the better and sometimes for the worse. Obviously, we would not have had the UN and its form if it weren't for the tragedy and the horror of the Second World War. Europe is doing rather well so far with regard to its strategic response to COVID, in terms of looking more strategically with regard to the issue of integration and the future of addressing economic disbalances and so on and so forth. Unfortunately, it doesn't work too well at all when it comes to enlargement. So Dean Tritsky was mentioning frustration about being left out of clubs, and I think this is very much the case in the Western Balkans as a result of the EU's lack of appetite, manifest lack of appetite to extend itself into the Western Balkans. And then in such situations, personalities do matter a lot, for better or for worse.
So please tell us, if you were today elected Secretary General of the United Nations, what would be your first decision? What would you do first?
The one thing that I learned from the race for Secretary General is that you should never answer this question, honestly, if you intend to be elected. So,
but now let's assume you are
I revealed most of my cards with regards to what I would intend to do if I were to be elected Secretary General, and Mr. Guterres revealed close to none. He won and I lost, although in the final. So this was a big lesson that I learned from my running process.
That's right. But now let's assume you are Secretary General of the United Nations. What is for you the first most pressing issues that you would address as Secretary General?
I think the return to the centrality of the Agenda 2030 for sustainable development for the whole world. Only 5 years ago, we adopted the Agenda for Sustainable Development. And believe it or not, right now, not a single country in the world, not the US, not Sweden, not anybody, is on track to fulfilling the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. I think it's a huge issue for humanity right now, and it's comprehensively taking together all the challenges that we're currently facing. So going back to centrality of multilateralism, going back to centrality of fulfilling the Agenda for Sustainable Development, that would be my highest priority as Secretary General.
Okay, thank you. Now, you know, the whole issue about the electoral process in the United States, Secretary of State Pompeo say we don't give a bad example to other countries because we ask other countries to respect their electoral process. And obviously, the big challenge of the world leaders, including the Secretary General of the United Nations, should we recognize the new president-elect or not, as, for instance, President Erdogan has done. What do you have to say to that, Mr. Yakis?
First of all, I would like to say that we should wish that Mr. Jeremek was elected to Secretary General, especially for the agenda, world agenda, which is the environment and the other things. This is one thing. Secondly, I would like to make an adjustment in your presentation of my political career. I am one of the founding members of the ruling party, but I left the party now because of my disagreement on Turkey's policy in the Middle East, in Syria, relations with Egypt, and especially in Libya. So this will shed a light also in the answer, in the comment that I'm going to make regarding Mr. Erdogan's congratulations for President-elect Mr. Trump.
Biden.
Mr. Biden.
Make sure.
I think Turkey was slightly late in congratulating, because I presume that Mr. Erdogan expected that Trump's rejection or demand for the recounting could lead to something which would change the result. For this reason, he held its congratulations for a few days, and ultimately, when the United States public opinion admitted that it was a victory for Mr. Biden, then he decided to extend the congratulations. But of course, the Turkish government is very uneasy now because Erdogan had the personal relations with President Trump, and he could call him very frequently and persuade him on telephone and push him to do something which in the long run shouldn't have been done. This type of relations between Erdogan and Trump, of course, was interesting and perhaps useful for Erdogan, but the statements made by Biden in the past about what he should do in case he comes to power, he should do with Erdogan, then the future is not going to be as easy as it would be in the time of Trump. But of course, Turkey and the United States are NATO allies. They have very close interlinkages in their interest because of the presence of the NATO forces, American forces in Turkey, and of course missiles and nuclear warhead missiles in Turkey. All these things, and also Kurdish issue and the Middle East, Turkey being close to the Middle East, all these things make Turkey and the United States two countries that are condemned to cooperate. They cannot otherwise.
Let's not forget that actually President Erdogan is not alone in that position. I believe Prime Minister Netanyahu has also congratulated President-elect Biden. So this is obviously choices that are tough. I want to fall back now on Russia and on the rhetoric. Joe Biden had very harsh words towards Russia during the campaign, and it will be difficult once confirmed that he changes that tone towards Russia, and particularly if he wants to tackle the systemic challenge that the United States is confronted to vis-a-vis China. So basically, that the question is addressed to you, Mr. Troitsky. Do you believe that criticizing Russia is part of an American populism, electoral populism for Democrats, or do you think that it is a sincere geopolitical attitude that the United States is now undertaking probably 30, 40 years after the Cold War stopped?
Well, I think President-elect Biden has a long history of engaging with Russia, and now you see pictures of him all over the web meeting with, with Secretary General Brezhnev at some point in the late 1970s, and then certainly with Secretary General Gorbachev, and on and on and on. So, I mean, he is no novice in addressing, the Russia dimension of the U.S. foreign policy. And I think of the Biden administration, we can use the definitive article apparently here already, will certainly not be up to blocking the sanctions, should those sanctions be initiated by the Congress, for example. So Donald Trump would often block those sanctions, whereas Mr. Biden, I don't think will have, if those sanctions really, come to fruition, But otherwise, I think if there's no reason to sanction Russia for anything, then President Biden is going to be amenable to a better relationship, a more, stable one, arms control, things that Russia really likes to do with Americans. So I wouldn't be very much alarmed. And you can read mainstream Russian commentators who think, we can reach out to Biden and we can work with the United States.
Okay, thank you, China, I suppose would be the answer to the follow-up to your answer. Mark, would you like to address the issue of confronting Russia? Is it a populist attitude on election time for example, not only the Republicans, but also actually the Democrats versus Trump's attitude towards Russia?
I mean, I agree with Dean Trotsky, and I think that a lot of the critique, even from people like me, if you read my columns that have been in different newspapers, have been focused on how Mr. Putin has been dealing with issues. And I do see a great distinction between a leader of a country, as I even pointed out in my first comments about COVID, between what a president does and what other people in the country are doing. So I think that we are going to try to find commonalities with Russia, as we should, as I agree. I mean, there are a whole series of issues we should be working with them on. And even with China, although I am one of the people who has criticized China for, I'll say, 20 years plus. And so I don't think it's just a game of the politics of the Democratic Party in what Joe Biden said in his campaigning. And of course, one has a tendency to try to get one's base out. So in the Democratic Party, you speak more to the left, and in the Republican, you speak more to the right. But I do think that the US has a vested interest and also wants to have better interactions with Russia. But it doesn't mean we're just going to, drop over and turn on our backs when countries are trying to source information for elections and so on. So I don't think that has to constantly be an issue. And I also think it's important in dealing with the Middle East that our relationship with Russia is better. And of course, also in dealing with North Korea and in dealing with a whole series of issues, whether it's the pipelines or so on. But I want to just make one comment about the whole talk we've been having about multilateralism and internationalization. I always have a conflict in myself between whether institutions should be representative and therefore have countries and nation states who one doesn't agree with on a variety of issues being part of something, or whether having them prima facie be part of it actually gives them a legitimacy if in fact they're violating human rights, if in fact they're supporting terror groups, if in fact they're blocking different things in their own country. So the balance between having the institutions representative versus having them functional, I don't always know if having players involved who are clearly violating international norms, having them involved is a good thing. That doesn't mean you can't meet with them offline. It shouldn't meet with them offline. You should.
Okay, Mark, we have actually, you raised a question that is bordering at actually ethical issues. And we have actually not only countries that are faced with these questions or controversies or allegations such as human rights, etc. We also have a private corporation and the role of multilateral institutions. I'd like to now mention, for example, the W.H.O has validated Pfizer as a vaccine the very day that the president of Pfizer made an important stock sale of his stock options on the stock market. How can you believe in the partiality of the WHO after this type of attitude from, for example, multilateral companies that do not respect actually or that endanger the impartiality of the WHO? Who would like to take on this ethical issue on multilateral institutions and the role of multilateral companies, powerful ones? And I'm not talking also about the IT companies, etc. I mean, we have to see that the way the UN has been set up was to deal with member states, and now we have obviously companies that are a lot more powerful themselves and their own agenda than a lot of many countries in the world. Who would like to take on this issue?
Mark is the best placed person to comment on this. Mark.
Okay, let's have Peter Ballas respond to that, and then we'll have Mark. You suggested follow up on it.
Yes, I suggested Mark because he is knowledgeable on the subject.
Okay, let's have Peter Ballas, who raised his hand. Please go ahead. The floor is yours, Peter.
I think all of us, we can give some answers, some reactions to this very interesting question. Now, starting from the daily experience of the European Union, some member states are insisting on direct representation of the member states, and we have a lot of phenomena in that respect. If you only take the family photos after each and every EU summit meeting, everybody would like to be on the photo. I would prefer one single executive person speaking in the name of all, instead of making this class photos. Then we have one commissioner per member state in the commission, which is a nonsense because we would need people for sectors, for specific jobs, and not a second representation of the states in parallel with the council, where they are there anyhow, and so on. So, but it depends to a large extent on the degree of the cooperation spirit, on the willingness, whether the participant states are ready to give a larger mandate to that organization, and then money, staff, and all the rest comes with that, or they want to sit there. There is a negotiation formula in the EU, and the EU is treating with a third state about an agreement. Then there is a core delegation composed from the Commission experts, and behind them there are sitting the representatives of the member states, and the Commission people call them the mothers-in-law. Sitting behind, the mothers-in-law with big ears, listening everything and interfering into the family affairs. So I think that the more we are willing to cooperate, the larger the mandate of an organization is, and the less we have representatives, direct representatives of the member states.
Okay, we have questions for Mark. Obviously, we have a lot on our plate. We have about 15 minutes to go still, hopefully. And basically, some major issues concerning, for example, those big corporations and their taxation. We have also not raised the WTO problem with obviously countries undermining, such as the United States, undermining the operation of the WTO. And last but not least, I also want you, Mark, to discuss something that was mentioned in our second panel, namely by Arlan Woolman, who actually mentioned the importance of US-China functional relationship. And because he's a military strategist, he talked about the fact that Joe Biden should meet with Xi Jinping for a couple of days to define new rules of engagement, as he mentioned. I don't know whether there is a red telephone line between Washington and Beijing, such as the one that existed during the Cold War with Russia. So these are all issues we need to address. And also, I'd like you to have a take during this session, before we close it, on the vaccine diplomacy. So please, Mark, if you can touch upon some of these points. The floor is yours.
Well, Harlan and I often disagree on China. It is one of the countries that I have huge problems with, and not because of the people, but because of the way the system is. And given that I was opposed to communism and helping dissidents and our foundations were, I have a predisposed problem with that. So the question of whether I think the relationship and a kind of a red telephone is going to exist, I think probably. I mean, if there's one issue where I happen to agree with President Trump, it is on his comments about China, even if I don't agree with the approach per se. The other thing about the sort of institutions and how they're going to function, the balance between having international institutions that are, as had pointed out by almost everybody on the panel that are not well funded, that don't have leadership, that probably, in my opinion, don't have the courage, competing with multinational corporations who do have the money, who do have the leadership, who do have vested interests, but not necessarily doing things for the correct reasons necessarily, not normally paying taxes. Even in the United States, the top 50 corporations are exempt from taxes. Often the corporation pays less tax than the CEO, him or herself, does because they have tax benefits. And so how do you then set rules when those institutions, which are private corporations or stock corporations, in fact, don't have a game plan or a control mechanism, an enforcement mechanism that can be used against them, and when they are often more powerful than the institutions themselves? As far as, I'm sorry, my brain is still on the campaign and we haven't been sleeping much. So
WTO, perhaps?
what was the other question?
WTO?
Yeah, sorry. And of course, it is an issue because, in fact, the World Trade Organization does, in fact, have amongst its members people that the US doesn't much respect. And of course, the US also doesn't necessarily, and it is criticized for this, like international institutions telling it what to do when it has traditionally been part of them and was prepared to support them. So that internal conflict still exists, Khalid, and it's probably not likely going to disappear in 4 years of the Biden administration.
So how can you overcome these structural limitations? I mean, we're trying to assess multilateralism beyond the current crisis and how to build a more efficient, effective one. To anyone in the panel, how can you deal? And if, Mark, would you like to follow on that? How do you deal with these structural deficiencies?
Well, one of the things that Yasser is referring to when I've complained before, I've complained about international companies working beyond and around and under international rules because they can get away with it when SMEs don't have those options and are the ones who are mostly burdened by the rules. As far as the question, like Peter said, extending, having more people in positions, having managers, I tend to agree with that, but you know, having a military background, which I do, the question becomes, when is having 500 million people in an army, or 20 million or 30 million, better than having an efficient small army that can do tactical operations and special operations? So it's a balance, and everybody's talked about that balance. I am more likely to err on the side of making a decision and carrying it out and living with the consequences than sitting, waiting, finding a balance, but in the end, you don't make a decision.
But yet you're undermining, in the meantime, gradually these institutions, such as not appointing judges within the WTO dispute board.
That's all true, Khalid. There's always a conflict of interest in political leadership between making decisions, taking an order, giving that order to people, or if the five of us were an executive board of a company making a decision, and then how you include people and how you then extend that to be more democratic, although plenty of people won't agree with my point on this, but being democratic doesn't necessarily make the institution more efficient.
So, Vuk, you ask for, obviously, to respond to that. Basically, just before you respond, can we allow a member state to undermine the functioning of a multilateral institution, such as, for example, not blocking the appointment of judges at the WTO, etc.? Is that a way of dealing with multilateral institutions, by stifling them literally or cutting them funding? Go ahead, Vuk. I know I threw another issue to your answer, but if you could address both at the same time, that would be, great.
I'll start with your question, and this is very much a reality that anybody who leads an international institution or who is an observer of how an international multilateralist institution works.
Could you speak up? We cannot hear you very well. Speak louder, please.
I say, like, it's very much of a reality that when you lead an international organization, or when you are an observer of the work of a multilateral organization, that you come to such situations, and you got to deal with it. And the expulsion, in my opinion, is very, very rarely an answer. So you gotta include and you gotta work it out diplomatically, at least in the United Nations. There were a few examples of suspensions, very, very few examples of suspensions of membership in the United Nations, by the way, my country included, but in the 1990s, and most of those things did not work out too well. But I wanted to address this issue of Joe Biden and Xi Jinping meeting soon and spending 2 days and trying to work out the differences. I think it's a little bit of an oversimplification, perhaps a little bit of naivete related to that. I think that the divisions between China and the United States are right now so deep, and the respective domestic politics of the United States and China are also very, very problematic, not terribly conducive to the smoothing of the functioning of this relationship. But having said all that, and I'm sure that Xi Jinping and Biden, if Biden ends up being president, are going to meet and work on the bilateral and multilateral agenda. But if there is any hope, whatsoever that we're going to have international multilateral system as we have known it for many decades since the end of the Second World War, if we're going to have it functioning in our lifetime, the only hope for moving things forward, is that the United States and China decide to do it together. There's absolutely no other way that there's going to be anything other than an ultimate division in our time that is going to be in many ways similar, of course, not identical, but in many ways similar to the second half of the 20th century with the ideological two block divisions. And especially in the field of technology, in the field of communications and artificial intelligence. If the US and China do not decide to save the idea of multilateralism in the 21st century together, we're not going to have it.
So you're actually literally opening the floor to the next question, which is actually the next issue that I asked, which is basically the vaccine rollout. China is obviously has tremendous capabilities to produce massively vaccines, and could then US and China rule of engagement perhaps embolden the WHO in, for example, the global distribution of vaccines between these two superpowers, to name just these two in the context of this discussion. Who would like to follow up on that? The vaccine diplomacy, using multilateral channels to distribute vaccine, to empower now, obviously WHO, which will need to be empowered. That would be one way of handling this discussion. And the other one is what can be done to fix the WHO. Obviously, is still based upon a global threat. An advisory role of the WHO still viable in addressing future health threats, such as we have witnessed during the corona crisis?
Well, I think vaccine politics, if I may, is going to be unilateral at the outset for obvious reasons, as long as governments are responsible for the well-being of their own population, first and foremost. So I believe vaccines will be rolled out nationally first. Although, by the way, the Russian government is on the record saying if Pfizer has a vaccine that is willing to supply to us, then our citizens will get the choice of getting shots of either our national vaccine or the Pfizer vaccine or maybe even the Chinese vaccine. I'm not sure if it's going to deliver on that, especially if the Pfizer vaccine turns out to be more expensive. But anyway, once those governments are happy with the initial results achieved on the national scale, I think it becomes obvious that you cannot open up your countries unless you feel secure about the virus being brought in by from other countries. So then I think they will follow up offering support if they are successful domestically, and if they have credibility. If that success is credible, then I think they will go out and look for multilateral solutions. I'm not sure whether they're going to rely on the WHO to mediate any of those transactions with other countries, but I do believe they will be attempting multilateral solutions, as long as it's clear that you cannot just solve.
You have been muted for some reason. Basically, okay, I think you can leave it at that. And basically, this could be also one way for China for the records to try and embolden the WHO with the massive vaccine distribution policy. Now, the last question is really about the role of the WHO. Can we accept that on major threats such as a virus, the WHO remains just an advisory institution without enforcing any of the measures? How would you see the future of the WHO? Just to make sure we can answer in 1 minute, in one short minute, because we're told. How can we see the future of the WHO in its current mandate? Do you think the mandate should be revised, and should it have more enforceable powers?
Well, I think the mandate should be
1 minute each.
I'll take 20 seconds for this and then 20 seconds for my final comment. I think the mandate has to be revised. What part of it is their ability to enforce it, I think is still up, but I think that it can't continue the way it is now. And that's my opinion. And my final statement is, let me see if I can get this right. I don't have a book in front of me. So, spasiba bolshoi, teshuku aderin, kusanim sepam, chvala, and shukran and merci, to show that internationalism does exist in our country as well.
Peter, please.
Let me add that under the pressure of the COVID-19 pandemic, WHO has learned a lot, and the member states have learned a lot. So all that experience should be turned into practice and being used. I see one point where I would trust the WHO. This is the international commercialization of the vaccine, because there are various attempts in various countries, but before bringing it to other countries, there should be a WHO stamp that this has been approved experience and it can be used all over the world. And vielen Dank, you haven't mentioned that.
Thank you very much. Yes, sir, please go ahead.
I'm more in favor of certain flexibility, because if you set the rules very strict, then you cannot go out of it. The experience of the WHO should be maintained, but of course, the mistakes that it has done in the past has also to be taken into consideration. Flexibility and understanding, mutual understanding between countries is essential, in my opinion.
One brief answer about the revision of the terms of the WHO. I think yes, it's got to happen. If it doesn't happen, then the WHO is going to continue sliding into irrelevance. Yet the same thing is being said about the Security Council of the United Nations. Everybody knows that it's not representative. Everybody knows that it's got to change its composition and structure, the Security Council of the UN, if it's going to keep the relevance for the future. Yet there is very, very little hope that it is going to be done in the near future. The way to think about a UN, the way to think about a WHO change, I think, should be along the lines of the recent France and Germany proposal with regard to the potential ability to censure countries in the future.
Thank you. We have obviously rules that are very strict, for example, for non-nuclear proliferation, where we can bring the international community strongly behind that agenda. Dr. Troitsky, last word.
Yeah, thank you very much. I do believe there's always room for improvement with regards to any organization. I think the politics of changing the mandate of the WHO may be a little bit difficult. So I'm not sure how far we can go improving its mandate. That said, I think the organization and the international community have surely learned very important lessons during the pandemic, especially in its early stages. And I think many of the mistakes are not going to be repeated. So this kind of oversized influence of member states, politically correct statements and so forth. I think now, I think the basic takeaway for WHO from this crisis is that I think on balance, its credibility has increased rather than has been undermined. So I'm quite optimistic. Thank you.
On these words, I'd like to thank you all very, very much for your input into what is obviously a very complex issue of our time. We have exceeded, speaking about time, our deadlines a little bit, and this means that the discussions were lively. And I thank you very much. I look forward to seeing you all in Tangier next year, hopefully in a safe condition. In the meantime, and considering the spikes in all our respective countries of coronavirus, I'll ask you all to be very safe. And we look forward to next year's meeting in Tangier, hopefully. Thank you very much.